Well, I only managed to watch the first 15 minutes of this video, but I'm definitely prepared to share my thoughts on it whenever we all.
Okay, who here has watched all of it? Tekla. Okay, Erica. I watched all of it but fell asleep for the part they were talking about Beethoven Pastoral. It's lovely music. I was just tired last night, but so I can talk about any of it except for that.
I mean, I feel like, Matthew, if you watch the first 15 minutes, most of it is basically the same thing.
Oh, is it just like examples of what he talks about? Okay.
Different and like he finally, he gets to the end of what is the meaning of music. The meaning of music is just whatever it makes you feel. So very, wise man.
Yeah, that was one of my questions from the beginning of the video. I had written down some discussion questions, and I was going to ask if we believe, based on the video, if Bernstein felt that music had an objective or a subjective meaning. And I think, Erica, you might be subjective king.
Yeah, for sure, subjective. What I found really interesting is how he talked about the music that had a story to it, like Don Quixote, and how even if music is supposed to accompany a story directly in that way, it's an extra musical element. And no one's ever really explained that to me before, because I've had so many coaches and lessons and whatnot. You guys probably remember this working with Dr. Thomas. They'd be like, you have to come up with a story to go along with the music, and that's what the music means. That's a very common teaching tactic for whatever reason, and it works for a lot of people. I know you said you'd like it, Matthew. But for me, it always just seemed like a distraction from my connection to the music. So I just thought it was cool that you said that,
But maybe I'm trying to decide whether that's redundant, because narrative is a good way to access your emotions and give labels to what is happening and how you relate to it, like that connection. Was the point of the video that narrative is a step in the meaning-making process, or did I miss something?
I guess his point, having gone through the whole thing, is that the meaning is inherent in the music, and it's just your experience. It's not like it really means anything. It's just whatever it means to you. So if you get a story out of it, that may be what it means, but it's not like there's one correct thing that is what music is. I think that's fundamentally what he was getting at.
I think it was really I think it was really effective that he used emotion as an entry point for the kids, starting with an example where he gave them a narrative, and then an example where he made up one, and then finally culminating in an example where are you okay? Okay. And then culminating in an example where he didn't give any background and let the kids assign their own story to it, which really is what the experience is about. But someone coming to it fresh, I think it's reassuring to have that story, like you said. And what he did was take it to the next step and say, like Carly said, it's subjective.
Something. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Erica.
This is just a quick thing. The one thing that I thought was not like weird, but I don't know if it was the point of it, but everything he used as an example, they were all programmatic except for the Tchaikovsky. Like you talked about Don Quixote and then pictures and the Pastoral Symphony. So, like, he got his point across really well with that. I kind of wish he had, used more non-programmatic examples, like Brahms or something. Because I feel like all of our examples that we're using for pieces now, it's all more absolute than programmatic. So I don't know if
that's a really good point.
Yeah, if you're saying that because you want to see how he does it, I think you could find that in some of the other young people's concerts. But that also occurred to me. It is interesting how hard he's pushing the point that it's not just about the story, but everything he used was programmatic, and he spent a lot of time talking about that. So I guess it was an example in its own right.
Yeah, I mean, he did play the favorite, and that was purely. He said, "People call this music weird," and I thought that was an awesome moment. He said, basically, I think younger students are more capable of understanding this music better than older people who had certain expectations for music. And it was really cool to see him like kind of I don't know if the word is, but give the responsibility of the interpretation in like a gesture of respect to the kids, which so rarely happens. And the Vebren, that wasn't programmatic, and he was just like experience it and see what you feel like.
I have yet to see that, but that was really well said. I'm curious now to see that in action. Erica, to your observation about the repertoire, from what I was led to understand, Bernstein was arguing that all music is sort of the same, programmatic or absolute, except programmatic has this extra thing. So I'm left wondering, okay, maybe he thinks programmatic music is I guess it has absolute qualities, and then there's this other sort of frosting on top. What do you think?
I'm thinking. I wonder if, I don't know if this was his thought process at all, but if maybe, because programmatic and absolute music, there's such like kind of feuding like camps. If maybe he felt like he could, because he talked about the Vebren and the Tchaikovsky, but he didn't give them explicit stories like he gave to like the Don Quixote. And I wonder if he kind of thought that because it was already programmatic before, like the intent of the composer was for it to be programmatic, that he could put a story to it. And then maybe he thought that since, the Vebren and the other pieces that were intended to be absolute, he described them more in feelings because that's what the composer intended.
Okay, so are you saying that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, I'm trying to understand. Are you saying that programmatic music, according to Bernstein, is easier to understand with a narrative as a means of interpretation?
I think that's what he was saying. That's not what I think. I don't know if he was using that just as a vehicle for the kids to make it easier for them.
Oh, that might be true.
I mean, I think I can't speak for him, and I think it makes the most sense when you watch it because he seamlessly incorporates it with the example. But he did say pretty much explicitly, like when he was explaining programmatic music, he said like there is this story here just because the composer put it there, and it's not necessary in order to have an experience with the music. Like here's a little example on the piano of honky tonk, and that's fun. And there's no story, there's no meaning, but you enjoy it.
Yeah, if we're talking about Bernstein's perspective, I think fundamentally what he's getting at is that even the programmatic music stands on its own. If you were to remove the program, yes, in theory, it's still inherent in the music because that's what it's based off of, when you take a text and write music to it. But even if you didn't know that, you're still going to get something out of the music, and that's what it means. And then the fact that it's connected to a text or based in that is just another layer on top of the inherent meaning, I suppose. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Now, one thing I thought that was really interesting about the Tchaikovsky examples and what he was going over later is that he was still assigning feelings to them. And I guess that's the difference you're making, Erica, between absolute and programmatic. But still, in a way, he was kind of telling them what it meant before he played it. One thing you'd find really interesting, Matthew, I think, is how with the Don Quixote example, he made up a story with them. It was like the cowboys or something that had nothing to do with Don Quixote, and then played it. He was like, this is what it's about. But then he's like, no, this is actually the story it's based off of, and then did it again. It was just like a little interactive exercise. But that's William Tell. It was?
So they was like,
the Cowboys. The Cowboys was with William Tell. The exercise I'm talking about was Don Quixote. I can't remember what the fake story was because I knew that wasn't what it was about. But I think the idea is that when you have an audience that's unfamiliar with the music, it's supposed to demonstrate that it still kind of means the same thing to you fundamentally, but when you're thinking about all of the narrative, it can be kind of a distraction. I think that's what he was trying to show there.
Yeah, I think so. I think I haven't seen it, but I guess I'll be biased, but I've always held the belief that programmatic music can be both evocative and completely self-contained. Like it can also exist for its own sake. It doesn't have to be written for a thing.
I think Bernstein would agree.
It makes me wish I could listen to Don Quixote again without knowing, because I wonder what I would think, like listening to Don Quixote for the first time, not knowing there was a story. Because I feel like it's just so much, like just the way Strauss wrote, and especially with Don Quixote, like I don't know how I could remove this story from my mind. I think other pieces it's easier, but just like I think, like what context I listen to Don Quixote, like just because of all the different characters and the way he wrote it, the wind machine and stuff.
Especially as cellists, that's true, I think. Dude, were any of you guys, I know you weren't in my class, but in History 1, or maybe survey, I remember doing this exercise where the instructor played pieces of music for us. One of them was like the Dvorak Water Gnomes or something, but I'd never heard it before. But she just played these romantic, dramatic music works, and we were supposed to come up with a story to them, and to make something up. Yeah, did you do that? Okay.
No, I think Michelle did that with us.
Oh yeah, you were in the same. You had the same instructor.
Erica might not have been for that one. But.
Yeah.
This is kind of going in a different direction in the talk. It's near the beginning. I thought it was like really impressive, the part, you know, where he did the William Tell, like he sang the thing back and forth with the audience. I don't know, I didn't expect the audience to be able to do it. I guess a lot of those kids, like the audience is probably more familiar with classical music than like what we could do, but I thought it was like so cool. The kids, like they only heard it once in the beginning and they were able to like repeat it back to him.
Yeah, and that they knew, like in the Vienna Woods or something, whatever that second waltz was that he played.
I think he was picking tunes that were kind of like in the canon of pop music at that time. Like that was a period where like it was popular to be swing dancing and stuff like that. But it was impressive when he did the cueing with the kids. I think it was a really good example of how like little instruction you can give with something like that, and it can be a success.
Yeah, it was a great example. And I think it's something that we perhaps tend to forget as music students going so deep into music. But what I try to think of is like, what classical works would I recognize, you know, when I was that age, before I ever learned cello, before I ever got into this, back when if my mom had taken me to a concert, I would have cried and wanted to go. You know, because there's some things that are just in popular culture in that way. Like William Tell is definitely one of them. I think he played Blue Danube, which is another one. Even if you don't know what that's called, you know what it is. Beethoven 5, you know, all of these things. And a lot of them are in Fantasia, consequently, which was, I think, a large part of it at that time. But even still, you know, they come up in kids' movies and cartoons and stuff. So they know what it sounds like. They would be able to sing it back to you, even if they don't know what it's called or have never seen an orchestra play it.
Yeah, and like you said, I was also thinking about how he didn't get into the nitty-gritty as musicians might tend to, because we're used to the technical aspects of music. But he was giving these students so many tastes of a lot of different examples of repertoire. And I think that's important when you're doing one of these outreach concerts, is like, how exactly are we trying to educate? Are we trying to give a bunch of technical verbiage about what harmony is and explain how to make a blues scale, or are we trying to enter it through like how he did with emotion, and then just say here's a ton of music so you have an experience that's genuine, but it's not overwhelming.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. Something, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I noticed that he asked them all a question. I forget what exactly he said, but I just remembered that Annie was like, hey, you should create no fail zones, but he asked the audience a question, and then there was this cacophony of answers, and he said, no, it's this. But I think that was definitely outshone by all the other cool examples of things that he did. But that just might be a dialectual thing with teaching at the time.
I think if it's like a group response like that, it's okay. But calling an individual out would be a very different matter.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, this is something Tekla and I were talking about a lot, because I think it was you disagreed with what Annie said a little bit at first, and then we were trying to think of, what situations is it okay to tell a kid they're wrong? Because when you're trying to introduce them to music in that way, you don't want them to feel singled out. Like, I totally get Annie's point, especially if you have one kid that says something like that in front of the audience, you want to be like, no, that's wrong. There are only right answers in music. Because that's not really true all of the time. But to Bernstein's point, he was trying to make the point that it's not about cowboys, which is why he asked them the question. So I think you just have to keep in mind what your purpose is and how your response will make the kids feel, and decide based off of that. Like what Annie said is true, but it's not true in every situation. Because I think her example, the specific one she gave with the kid said Mozart or something, is a very good example of how to handle that situation. But on the other hand, I think the way Bernstein handled this was successful in working.
I think another difference is that Bernstein's, like, that whole thing was so different than what we're going to be doing. Is much more performative. Like, they were all in tuxes and, like, suits. He's on a stage. He's very clearly, like, above everybody. And he's also, Bernstein. So it comes with, like, the notoriety. So I think that's what made it okay for him to kind of, like, take charge of everything. We're on a much more even playing ground with our audience. So I think that's why we have to be more careful with.
Right. I'm not saying it wasn't okay, and I definitely agree that it was done to subvert expectations in order to hammer home a point. But I just saw it and wrote it down.
So I did think it was interesting. I wonder, like, how confused some of the kids were. Like, that's one thing that I think he could have done better, just where he was talking about, like, Rossini, and he's like, well, it actually wasn't about cowboys at all. He lived in Italy, and he was writing about, Switzerland. So I think that kind of thing, like, getting too abstract for kids, almost.
To his goal. Yeah, that was one thing. I understand why he put that example first, because it's high energy, the kids would have known it, but like just it being an opera overture, opera music is programmatic, maybe not in the same way as pictures, but there's a story that goes along with it. But the overture is kind of not like that, but also kind of summarized. But composers created that in a different way, and that's like a lot of nuance to explain there. So I didn't really like the example because of that, because of what I know about it. But maybe it was effective for the kids. I don't know. It's hard for me to put myself in their shoes in that way. But
I was actually trying to find like post interviews or something with the kids, like that was a part of it, because I was interested in that. Couldn't find anything.
You said you couldn't find any? Oh, bad luck. That would be really insightful. Yeah, I'll have to go back and watch the rest of it and take more notes. I wish I had more time to do that, but.
Do you have any other questions? Did you write anything else down?
I have one more, but it's not really a question. I just wrote down a bit that he said in the beginning where he talked about, what exactly did I say? Yeah, he said I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, it's just part of human nature to listen to music. Like, why do we listen to music? We just do. The music itself doesn't really draw us to it in any way that we can measure. And I was disappointed he didn't share any more insight into this point, because, I expected him not to, just because of the venue and the audience and what they're there to do.
I was thinking that too. Well, he elaborates on that later, doesn't he? I remember him talking about that towards the end.
Oh, does he? Oh.
Well, yeah, it kind of ties into the way music has an emotional impact. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. It's just kind of coming together in my head. This is something I feel like I always instinctually understood about music, but I didn't really know how to articulate it. It's been a couple of things. Like the artist therapy book, I know you were reading, Erica, so you might be able to back me up on this, but that's speaking more generally about paintings. but I think it's directly transferable to music, is how it goes into these aspects that we're uncomfortable with ourselves or are just unfamiliar to us, but makes them more appealing in a way that we absorb them and like expand our understanding of being people. And I feel like music does that too, but just in an oral medium instead of visual. And it goes along with what Booth was saying too, that how art is different than entertainment. And the things that you're drawn to in those mediums are not always what's best for you. Sometimes it's uncomfortable to listen to Webern or whatever, but that doesn't mean you can't listen or learn something from it. And then there was something Annie said too that I'm trying to remember. This is tangentially related, but talking like the art is a part of human nature, what Bernstein said. Annie mentioned the example of there being cave paintings, these different aspects of art, and people were singing and making instruments at those times too, not maybe symphonies, but making art is a part of human nature. It's been around a lot longer than politics or economics or a lot of these things that we consider important in the modern world. And it's like it's always been there, but people don't always value it now just because it's not as profitable. This is an interesting thing.
I think part of that might come from, I remember Eric Booth was talking a lot about reflection and how like today's society doesn't, prioritize reflection at all. Like as we progress, things are moving faster. We're supposed to like fill our time doing stuff now. Like that's just how the progression of everything works. So there's just less of an importance put on reflection, which is why I think, art is less seen as less important now. Because, like, music requires reflection, kind of, or maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Now I'm thinking
about what you're listening to, but I think on the whole I agree that it does.
Yeah, I would say so.
I mean, I'm thinking about it, and I think I could go like both ways. Like on one hand, music requires reflection because it's deeper in some ways than entertainment. You have to process more emotion. But then also part of what Bernstein was saying in his talk, it's just what it makes you feel. Like you don't have to think about it that much. It's just you hear a piece and it makes you feel like happy or sad, and that might be all you need to get from it.
Yeah. I would say in some cases the feeling you get could be a reflection in the way, because the feeling is one thing, but like how do you think about the way that you feel, like what thoughts come to mind when you feel that way? I think they're connected. And the dilemma you're encountering maybe is that it goes back to art versus entertainment, and whether or not you're reflecting on it or not may determine whether it's art, because in your case, if you have to think about it more, it's expanding your mind in that way, it would be art according to Booth's definition. But if you're not thinking about it that much, you just want to like exist and absorb the sounds, that's more of entertainment. It's something that's familiar or you enjoy for whatever.
I agree. I think part of what sometimes makes people feel that classical music is inaccessible is exactly what Carly said, that in order to have a legitimate experience, you have to find something novel or insightful from listening to a piece of music. And even like us, after a USO concert, everyone like rushes to each other and they're like, to hear the bassoon solo in the third movement, and then if someone's like, I didn't notice anything, they're like, oh, well, so-and-so wasn't really listening. And exactly what you guys said, I think you need to make it clear that just listening to a piece of music and feeling something purely based off of yourself, I think that's a reflection, and I think that is worthy of encouraging.
Yeah, the idea that Erica, you said that Bernstein shared with the audience that you should just listen to music and like feel something. That seems pretty impressionistic to me, that there really isn't thought put into how you're feeling. And I'm wondering really if entertainment becomes art when we think about its effect on us more. Is art this whole separate class of decidedly edifying things? Well, how do we determine if something is decidedly edifying? entirely subjective in and of itself.
Yeah, I see what you guys mean, because when you listen to the way Bernstein said it, it was quite simplistic. But you also have to consider he's talking to kids, and he's just like, think about how the music makes you feel, you know, being experiential in that moment. Like, if Matthew or I had tried to explain it to them that way, they'd just be like, what are you talking? Or they probably would have tuned out 5 minutes ago. But I think that's what he meant. But, you know, you just can't say it to them like that, because you'll confuse them more than help them.
Oh, right. So, I'm just wondering really if you were to take some time and think about an episode of Seinfeld, does it become art?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I have no idea. I don't know if I agree with this, but I could see somebody saying that maybe it becomes art when when you learn something new, like when it teaches you something new. Because I'm trying to think, like, an example for me is like I've listened to the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto probably like 30 times because I just do it when I'm bored because it's just so much fun, like on any car ride. And half the time when I listen to it at this point, it's just nice background noise. So I'd say it's like entertainment because I've heard it so many times. But sometimes, you know, there might be a moment where if I'm on a long drive and I happen to be thinking more than normal and I'm listening and it gives me some like new feeling or new realization, then, you know, maybe I'd say it's more art. So I think the same thing can be art and entertainment. It just depends on where you're coming from at the time when you're absorbing it and like how it makes you process it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like that a lot. But now I'm thinking maybe it's just like anything has the potential to be art, but whether or not it's realized depends on the person and how you're thinking about it, the circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, Erica. I also routinely listen to that piece, and I don't learn anything new per se, but I like to imagine myself like wailing out on the violin playing that concerto, and it just makes me feel like a superstar when I'm driving to Walgreens or whatever. And then people are looking at me like, what is he smoking? And the car is next to me. I don't know if I agree that you have to learn something new in order for art to be art. I don't think art is exclusively an exploration in novelty, and I don't believe you are of that mind either. I don't like using exclusively because that's just not how we operate. This really isn't a field with a lot of black and white areas. But I think art is I think it's, if anything, more experiential. And music, I'm just going to say that I believe music is the highest form of my definition of art because I think of it as like an encapsulation of time. Like there's this organism with a birth and a life and a death. There's a nice contained circularity there of growth and ending that I appreciate, that you can find in static media. I guess I'm just biased or simply not well equipped enough to understand it. My cousin is a studio artist and he talks about loudness in his paintings with like brush strokes and color. I'd be fascinated to learn more about that.
Do you think it'd be a similar, so you're kind of talking about music as the highest form because there is like a process to it basically, like what you said, middle and end. So what, like, I do probably because I'm biased also, but just like as a devil's advocate sort of thing, do you think it'd be the same if there was like a live painter or something, you know? Or like if you could just not freeze, but like take the specific moment in time where somebody's writing a poem, something like that.
I think it'd be fundamentally different because I would see the process. I'd get like a sort of four-dimensional view of this static piece. But if I had some insight into what the poet was thinking and feeling and maybe if I could like put on this helmet and sort of read their mind as they're writing this poem, I think that would be cool. But that might take some of the fun out of it too, because I think the interesting part about poetry is deriving meaning from it, not necessarily reading it off of Cliff's Notes or whatever. That's an interesting question.
Well, Bernstein also said, this is a piece about a painting, but it's only a depiction. You can't he said something like you can't brush a painting with your nose or clarinet or something. He said, what makes a depiction of a painting is that you feel something evocative of what you would feel when you saw the painting. And I think for different people, they get that feeling in different ways. People who are more attuned to oral experiences are going to probably feel closer to paintings than, did I say it wrong?
Yes.
Visual, no, I said it wrong. Visual experiences will be drawn to paintings. Oral experiences will be drawn more so to music. And for students, it's all abstract, but there are going to be people who resonate more with those oral experiences because they can more easily attune that in their mind.
What are your thoughts, Carly?
Well, I'm just thinking about this. I mean, we're going off of this definition, but it seems that we all don't entirely agree with it, and that's okay. It doesn't mean he's right. But I think if we go back to it, it's useful to assume that the music we're playing for the audience is art to them. If it's unfamiliar, because in many cases it will be. Maybe not with toccata and fugue, but most things, ligeti certainly. But I just think it's useful to use it as a framework because we're presenting to them as art, as something that's unfamiliar, but we have to find a way to introduce that to them because we are there and we know more about it in most cases than they will. And we also have to find a way to entertain them as part of that process. Because if you were to just sit them down at a concert or whatever and play through these pieces all the way through, they'd probably be bored, they wouldn't really get it, and they wouldn't understand what they're supposed to be getting out of it as art in order to experience it that way. I mean, I certainly feel that was the case as a student, or a young kid, before I started playing cello and got interested in classical music and understood all of these elements. So really what I'm interested in doing through this process is like finding a way to introduce kids to art forms in that way without necessarily having to teach them an instrument. If they didn't have the opportunity to do that or haven't yet for whatever reason. It doesn't mean they never will, but just making this music accessible to more people as listeners, not as players.
I think interactive concerts, Carly, are the best way to do that. Because I was just thinking about what you said, and we were introduced to art, really, like if you go down and sit down and watch a concert, the same way we go and enjoy entertainment. You sit down and you watch a TV show or something. I think that might muddle the mixture a bit between the two, because it might draw an association between, how much fun you had watching this cartoon and sitting down doing this thing, versus sitting down and watching this concert that's supposed to be this edifying work of all these titans of the repertoire. So it might be viewed in the same lens. And I think it'd be a good idea to destroy that association by fundamentally changing the means of presentation, which is, I'm guessing, why we're all here.
This is a bit of a sidetrack, so forgive me, but I was wondering, I wanted to hear y'all's thoughts. When I was watching the concert, something our speakers have spoken a lot of is that the performers have to have a genuinely positive experience as well as the audience. And it didn't really look to me that the Berlin Phil musicians were having a great time. Maybe that's like, they're just old, pasty white men, and maybe that's what they look like when they're having a good time. But they, I just wondered if you all felt like in that sort of experience setup, that was something that there was equal experience, granted that they played, an entire piece at the end, or if there was a way you would want to balance it more so that it was equal if you were to do it yourself.
I think that comes mainly just from how different symphonic playing is than chamber playing. I think for like a young people's concert with a symphony, they probably could have looked like they were having a little bit more fun, but also there isn't that much room for it just because of the nature of how symphonies are. That's why I think Annie talks all about why chamber is like the best way to do it, just because it allows for so much more individuality and stuff. So I think it's like I don't think it can be helped. I think it's just the nature of any symphony thing that'll be like that. There needs to be like one star, that's Bernstein. He's having all the fun for everybody else, and everybody else is just kind of a tool for the music almost.
Yeah, that different dynamic is very important to consider, because you have a conductor with orchestra and it's really just the conductor talking, and like Erica said, he's the star of the show. It's that way in all of the young people's concerts. But when you're in that environment, you have 70 people on stage, that's the way it has to be, because you can't have 70 people talk. It would be way too distracting. And also in the advice from the speakers, all of them are assuming that we're doing chamber concerts because that's what we told them in our initial meeting. So that's where that advice comes from. I know what you mean though, because I saw that when I was watching it too. Some of them just look like they don't want to be there, and it's not helping the fact. I don't know if you can avoid it entirely, because I have met so many career symphony musicians that have the philosophy that they want to show up and play the music and get paid, and that's it. And they don't know anything else for the survival of the art form or whatever. So you're good. I don't know that that's avoidable really, unless you were to put a group together specifically to do outreach concerts and everyone in the symphony was really into it, which is an idea, but that's kind of why I'm interested in sticking with chamber groups in the meantime, because that way you have a greater outcome of success, and there's a way to involve everyone who's on stage, which I think is helpful for the audience. There's less, and there's a certain, well, really anonymity when you're in an orchestra, because you just become a member of a section. You're not so much an individual, and it has to work that way because of how many people there are on stage. And with a chamber group, there's a little more individuality, as well as more of an opportunity for each individual to engage with the audience.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, it's real quick. I also, like, the distinction is important. I also don't think that, I know I said before that, like, chamber music is really important, but I think they both have their own merits. I think, like, having young people's concert with the symphony, even though it's not as personal and not everybody there, might be giving it their 100%. But I also think just the effect of a symphony and that music can do a lot for a kid, just, in a sense of wonder. This doesn't really have to do anything with what we're doing, because we're not going to do symphonies, obviously. But I don't think it's necessarily worse. I think it's just different. Because I know, if I were a kid, it's a little bit different coming from me just because I know about classical music. But going to that, young people's concert would be so much fun. Just see the symphony, pulling their whole...
There were some kids, I remember in the video, that were the embodiment of what you just said. It was so cute. They'd be staying there and they're or he played a ragtime. There was one kid I was
That's something you just made me think of, Erica, is the experience of being in the audience is very different from what we're considering, because they're in the New York Phil Hall, and there's 1,000 people in there, school kids busking from all over the place. And that actually kind of mirrors the experience of being on stage, is there's kind of an anonymity in the audience. Not everyone there is going to get to make a personal connection with Bernstein or the musicians on stage. It's not possible. You're a member of a group, and that's how it works. Whereas what we're doing, I'm expecting we're going to be playing for smaller groups, maybe some school assemblies, but not in concert halls, not at least yet. That's a more eventual thing that we might do in our own careers. But, some of the places I've played, like the homeless shelter or the hospital or something, there's not more than 10 or 15 people watching you at a time, and you get to interact with people on a more individual basis. And I think chamber music is just better suited to that kind of venue, which is why I was going with that route with this project. But that is something to consider, is how the dynamic on stage mirrors the audience and what might be more appropriate for different settings.
Tucker, to answer your question about the atmosphere being, I think, the atmosphere is very important. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a chamber concert. I think it's very important to have a I don't know, conducive to connection. I don't really think it helped that all of the musicians were really dressed up. I would be of a different opinion if they were in casual clothes, but I think that's just like what you had said, prefacing your question, really a product of the time. But moving into this new topic as to the effectiveness of symphony and chamber outreach concerts, I think, I'm just going to echo the sentiments of everyone here. Really, yes, they both have their merits. I'm privy to chamber because of the connectivity. I think it's important. I think it's more important to intimate someone with classical music, because I think a sense of wonder can be achieved there. I think it can be more easily achieved in a symphony, just because there's inherently a greater capacity to generate a soundscape and to, it's bigger. It's a bigger tool, right? But I think chamber outreach concerts have more powers of persuasion, just because there isn't really, as much of a, I don't want to call it a dichotomy, but it isn't a bunch of people and you as a listener. It's like maybe 4 people and they're sitting over there.
I think another important difference between the two is that when it's a symphony concert, like the young people's concert, the dynamic is so different because it's, the audience is coming to them, like they're coming to their, like, home ground. And then when it's an outreach concert, it's us going to them. So in a way, it's more like we're serving them, kind of.
Yeah, I get it. They're more in their element, which might also be more comfortable because of context-dependent learning or whatever.
Oh no, I meant it was more of a good thing. Like,
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I'd be privy to doing both, of course. I think it'd be fun, and I'm curious to see how symphony outreach concerts work. And I'd really like to hopefully like get coffee with Dr. J just to talk to him and see how those things tick. That would be interesting. I'm sure he'd be available for it, but that would just be cool because we've learned so much about these. Can't help but wonder. Let's see, did anyone else have any other questions or statements of profound insight?
I was just going to say the main difference I'm getting is the upside to the chamber music concert is personal connection, connecting with people on a more intimate level with the audience. But I think the reason they trended more towards symphony back then is just the sheer impact of it. I mean, if you've never heard a live orchestra playing like that before, it is quite impressive. And I think they were hoping to win kids over that way. But one thing I wanted to touch on is what you're saying about the dress now too, is they were all very dressed up, they're in Texas. But if you notice how the audience was dressed, that was just a social expectation in 1958. We said, if you went to the symphony, you had to dress up nice. We do not have to do that. I know Dr. Jones has talked about it. I'm not sure if it was you 3 or my class or whatever, but just that is a very important consideration to the environments you're going into. Because if you go into a Title I or Title III school or whatever it is, dressed up in tuxes, you're not going to make a good impression, So you just have to consider your audience. And I think most people agree that more casual is appropriate, but it just depends.
I'm of the same mind. Symphonies are quite the tour de force, and with young, impressionable kids, what better a way to hammer home classical music and introduction. Did anyone? Oh, sorry, Erica, go ahead. Sorry.
Very, off topic and possibly a very quick, easily answerable question.
Yeah.
Because one of the differences is that, in the young people's concerts, all the examples were programmatic. And there's so much programmatic symphony music. Are there any program quartets or chamber music things? Do you know?
Yeah. Is Dvorak American, not programmatic?
I guess
Not really.
Because it's
like,
I thought
I mean,
programmatic
it's
was.
programmatic in the same way New World is. I think Death and the Maiden is maybe a better example. That's what comes to mind. I know there are a lot of 20th century ones. I don't know that well, but you might be right. I tend to associate that more with the Dvorak. Is there an actual story that goes along with that one? Transfigured Night. Transfigured Night is directly based on a poem. There are some others from around that time. Yeah, it just as well. There are a lot of arrangements of things too. Like I know there's a quartet arrangement of Beethoven 6. Let's see what else. You can find it. Certainly, Simple Symphony. You can do that.
Programmatic music is universally evocative of a specific thing. It doesn't have to have a program specifically of written words. Dvorak's ideas of the American West are so universally embodied in String Quartet Number 12. Smetana, From My Life, he may have written out in one of his journals or something like what each part of the piece is supposed to represent, some extra musical meaning ascribed to the piece. I think that's really the crux of programmatic music, whether the composer has attached extra musical meaning in some capacity from the title of the piece, how it evokes something. That's one of the clues I had to look for when I was writing my music history 2 paper. I had written about the development of viola technique through absolute chamber music. I had looked at Dvorak, the G major quartet, because I love that piece so much. And the third movement is not absolute. It's based on a Czech folk dance, and it's therefore evocative. It doesn't have that sort of amorphous meaning that we understand absolute music to have. I think absolute music has the potential to have many different meanings. You can think of it like musical stem cells. They could be anything. Yeah, I didn't mean to go on a tangent about your very easily and readily answerable question, but I hope you had one provided to you nonetheless.
No, that was very helpful. It was very interesting. I was just wondering because I honestly couldn't think of anything, but I didn't think of American. But yeah, so do you think? Oh, one more thing. So you're saying it's programmatic because it's based off of the folk dance?
Yeah.
So do you think anything based on any dance is programmatic too, or do you think it's just that?
Well, that specific movement was. To answer your question in a phrase, I would say case by case, but that specific movement has the rhythms of this Czech dance and the same form and some of the same harmonic characteristics. So you would have to evaluate the degree of similarity in the formulation of your conclusion. I decided yes, and there was this guy who wrote a book about the interpretation of Dvorak's music. Granted, it was his interpretation, but he was of a similar mind. I can't fashion the name for you, but I'll send it in the ideas chat because I'm talking about it now and it would be selfish of me not to.
This was a ways back, but I just wanted, sorry for popping up. I wanted to remark on Matthew's response about audience engagement and how the nature of a large audience is very different. And that's something we actually talk a lot about in music ed, is like magnitude versus proximity.
Can you speak up? There are people.
Yeah, so there's magnitude, and that's like, you can have a diffuse magnitude for a large crowd of students, but if you're going to be successful in engaging a large audience, you also have to have a level of proximity, in that you're able to connect with the students. And Dr. Thomas is very good at this, kind of diffusing her energy, but not in a way where you're like approaching an audience and you're really excited, but it's so diffuse, it's like over everyone's heads. If that makes sense. And of course, I have no idea how it goes for Bernstein, but the nature of that is inherently different from what we're trying to do here.
So is it finding the balance between outgoing and bubbly and intimate?
Yes. So when I went to the Juilliard symposium thing, I did this exercise where you meet someone and each person is assigned a mood when you shake their hand. You're either like kind of withdrawn, you're engaging, or you're like over the top. And then you're paired off with either alternating people of energy or equal levels of energy. And what they found is if you're like over the top, really excited, motivated the whole time, you're not going to connect with someone because it doesn't feel genuine. And even if you have a lot of energy, it feels inauthentic and it just kind of washes past them. But if you really like look them in their eye, you don't have to be down in the dumps like they are too in order to connect, but there has to be some sort of moderation.
That's really cool. That's important to consider. I didn't think of that. I thought it was just put the smile on and hope for the best. Thank you for mentioning that. That's really insightful.
Something I remember from the readings that I thought was an interesting way of thinking about it is Wallace compared this to like reading a room when you're doing stand-up comedy, because there was some example of playing in clubs and environments like that, and you have to be able to read a room really well and adjust the way you're interacting with them, that magnitude you were talking about, based off of that. And I'm just thinking I can remember some successful examples and some not so successful examples from when I was in high school and people would come do outreach things at my school. And sometimes they would just treat us like babies, and a bunch of 16-year-olds were like, who are you? I remember, do you remember Barrage 8 at FGCU? Did you ever know about that, Matthew?
No, I don't know.
You do? Oh, Tekla knows. Interesting. Okay. Well, basically, it's a string octet, but they play like electric instruments and dance around, which was already kind of lost on me. But we did this workshop with them, and they were just trying to get us to move, but they were very like over the top and getting in our face. And they were like, "You guys have to do it, like dance it." And it was a section of 7 or 8 cellos, and we were just like, "No, we're not gonna." They just refused, because of the way they approached us. And all they were asking us to do was like rock back and forth, but just the way they were interacting with us made us so uncomfortable. Like no one was gonna listen. We didn't respect them enough to do what they said, basically. So, hi Lisa. If you're getting that, if what you were doing isn't working, because they kept trying to do it, like you need to change your approach, because forcing kids to feel more uncomfortable is not going to make them listen to you. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. I did not like Barrage either, and they did a side-by-side thing with us. And it's kind of like what you said. If they're referring to the whole crowd, it's sort of that audience effect. They can kind of act like as a herd, but if you create those individual connections, even with a couple, and you know their names before they come in, them knowing that, they're going to be like, okay, there's a higher chance of they're just going to empathize with you just a little bit.
That makes sense. I think I, as an audience member, would understand them as having that capacity for being genuine. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be thought of as a part of a crowd or a child. That sounds horrid and embarrassing for them too, I'm sure. I'm curious as to how they accommodated a bunch of people who didn't want to do their little shtick.
Like I said, they just kept telling us to do it. They were like, come on, guys, get in. Like, they didn't change their approach at all. I mean, it's like someone told me about practicing, and it's probably told you at some point, insanity, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. So, you just have to be adaptable, and you have to practice what you're doing enough, meaning the speaking part of it, that you're comfortable with it. You don't have to think about it that much, and you can just adjust if the audience demands it.
Do you remember what happened next in your little horror story? I'm curious.
I mean, we were on stage. We were doing the workshop with them. It was dreadfully uncomfortable. Well, no, but there wasn't an audience. We were just in the high school auditorium or something. And Yeah, they kept trying to get us to do it, and no one was doing it. But they were like doing it to show us. But it was only the cellist guy doing it. It was just uncomfortable, and I partially blocked my memory.
I understand.
Yeah.
I won't bring up any repressed memories.
I don't think anything else happened. Really, it was just unsuccessful and awkward.
That's actually what inspired Carly for this project. She wants to rise above Barrage and show them how it's done. And one day they'll be in her audience and she'll make them do it.
Yeah, rock like us, Barrage 8. Sorry if you're lost. Well, did anyone else have anything to mention by way of the video or the readings or thoughts on any of our talking points?
Did you say there's no class? No meetings next week?
Yes, there is no class next week. Cool. Well, I think we can go ahead and call this one. Thank you guys for, again, sharing your time with us. I will watch the rest of that video and post the Dvorak thing I had referenced earlier. For those of you at home, tune in every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern. Look in the messenger chat for links. And yeah, thank you.
Stay tuned for Thomas Cavanagh, who's coming, I think, the second week of July. Is that what we have him scheduled?
Yeah.
He's going to practice some compositional engagement techniques with us. So make sure you have your instruments.
Yes, get ready for improv. All right, see you guys.